Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the April CRSO training series, Devices and Clinical Research, a refresher on billing and regulatory requirements. A few notes before we get started. We want to thank everyone who attended and presented at the CCTS Spring Conference on Tuesday, March the 31st. Your participation is always an integral part in making our conference a great success. On another note, the CCTS is currently working on an update to the CRC 101 workshop, which will transition to a clinical research professional workshop. And we will be rolling this out in mid-August. So stay tuned for emails about the updates to this workshop. So following today's presentation, you will receive an email evaluation. We encourage you to complete that evaluation. The CCTS and the CRSO provide certificates of attendance for anyone that would like one for their records or for ACRP or SOCRA certification maintenance. As a reminder, you must be present for the speaker's entire presentation to receive a certificate of attendance. You will find a link for the certificate located at the bottom of the program evaluation you will receive later today. The objectives of today's presentation were included in the presentation invite. We have a group of presenters today. Our first speaker today will be Sarah Kuhl. Ms. Kuhl is the CRSO Clinical Trials Coverage Analysis Team Lead. Kate Applegate. Ms. Applegate is the CRSO Senior Clinical Trials Coverage Analyst. And Renee Hensley. Ms. Hensley is the UK Healthcare Senior Manager of Governmental Pay Administration. Please join me in welcoming Sarah Kuhl.
Thank you. So like Vicki said, I am the team lead for coverage analysis, and I've got others here with me to just give a refresher presentation on devices in clinical research as it pertains to billing and regulatory requirements. Uh, I was just talking about the general overview for today. We're going to just talk about the different types of devices, and then we're breaking them up into those specific requirements as they pertain to each device. So I'm going to go over the 510Ks, PMAs, and non-significant risk devices. Kate's going to talk about those IDEs, and then Renee will take it over with the CGS and regulatory requirements. So just in general, Medicare can cover certain FDA-approved and Institutional Review Board, or IRB, approved investigational devices and services incident to provided the investigational device meets certain requirements. And we're going to talk a lot more about those requirements. So in order for coverage criteria to be met, we need to talk about the Medicare qualifying status. Qualifying status is the biggest difference between device studies and non-device studies in terms of the coverage analysis. Once a device study is qualified for coverage, there are no major differences in our review process. We'll still review those national guidelines for conventional care, apply national and local coverage determinations, and we take into consideration equitable billing practices for participants. So what's the difference about the qualifying status and why does that matter? So most of you have seen our billing grids before, and you're really used to the non-device trials. This is where we apply that NCD 310.1 for qualifying status, and we determine this at our local office with our coverage analysts. Device studies are different. They can only qualify under Medicare Benefit Policy Manual Chapter 14, and instead of us making the determination, it comes from an agency, such as CMS, the IRB, and the FDA. So over here on the right, I've just included the qualifying checklist that you'll see in Encore for these device studies. And you can see how it's a little bit different from determining if a study, for example, has therapeutic intent or if it enrolls patients with diagnosed disease. So that's kind of like just what I want you to take away from this slide is that there's different policies that pertain to these trials. And then it's different organizations versus us making the determination for qualifying and not qualifying. So overall, here is a list of the different types of devices that we see and that Medicare will allow for coverage if criteria are met. We have the PMAs, which is the pre-market approval, the 510Ks, which is post-market. We have IRB approved non-significant risk devices. In addition, there's also IDEs, which are a little bit more complicated and have some extra requirements. And we also have humanitarian use devices and coverage with evidence development devices. The big takeaway here is that PMAs, 510Ks, and the IRB approved ones, as well as the IDEs, do require CRSO review. Humanitarian use devices and coverage with evidence development devices are not typically handled by our office, but I have included these links down here with more information about those and the Medicare rules as they apply to coverage for those devices. So first, I'm going to talk about the different requirements for these devices. So I've split them up between the 510K and PMA because of the considerations that we need to take into account in order to determine that qualifying status. The 510Ks and PMAs are a little bit simpler because they've already got an approval or clearance from the FDA, which ensures that these devices are safe and effective for the intended use. So we just need those FDA letters. We look at that intended use. We line that up with the protocol eligibility criteria, and they generally qualify for coverage. The IRB approved non-significant risk devices are a bit more complicated. It's up to the sponsor to initially make that non-significant risk determination, and they need to present it to the IRB. This can be a central IRB, and then they can just forward us that letter. Or if they don't use a central IRB, it will be up to our local IRB. So if the FDA has already made a significant risk or non-significant risk determination, then the sponsor doesn't make that risk. They've already submitted it to the FDA, and that FDA ruling is final. But if it hasn't been submitted to the FDA, that's when the IRB reviews the sponsor's risk determination for every investigational medical device, and then they modify the determination if the IRB disagrees with the sponsor. If the IRB disagrees with that non-significant risk determination, then it will have to be submitted to the FDA for that category A or B determination under the IDE process. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that later, or Kate will. She'll get into those details. So in order to submit these studies to us, it's very helpful if we have these specific documents. For every study, devices and non-devices, we do at minimum need the protocol and the consent form, and that's true for these device trials as well. For the PMA and 510K, since they've already been cleared by the FDA, we're going to need that FDA letter that shows they've been cleared and it has that indication for their intended use. It's also very helpful to have a draft budget. For the non-significant risk devices, since they're a little bit more involved, we do also need that sponsor determination as well as the IRB approval. If there is no sponsor determination because it has the FDA determination, then we'll need that as well as the IRB approval. And then from here, I'll go ahead and hand it over to Kate to talk about those IDE studies.
Thank you, Sarah. Go ahead and move on to the next slide, please. So IDE stands for Investigational Device Exemption. The FDA assigns devices an IDE number as well as a category, which is going to be either A or B, which I'll talk about that on the next slide. This determination is based on the device's perceived risk level. So a device can be recategorized. For example, if the sponsor changes the device's proposed indications or any other device specifics. We have seen this happen with, I think, one study here at UK before. Sponsors can also petition the FDA to change the category determination if they feel like the FDA's decision is not accurate. For studies that involve either categories of IDEs, routine care items and services that are furnished in the trial can still be billed to patient insurance as long as certain criteria are met. The first of those criteria is whether CMS has approved the study. CMS approval is not required to conduct an IDE study, but if that approval is not obtained, the trial can't be considered qualifying, and all study procedures must be paid for by the study sponsor. So we rarely see cases where the sponsor does not seek that CMS approval. The other criteria, of course, is whether the item or service that's being furnished in the study would normally be performed for those patients outside the context of a clinical trial. So whether it lines up with typical conventional care. Also, an important note about CMS approval, it is obtained per study, not per device. So if we have multiple studies that involve the same device, CMS approval is required or must be obtained for coverage for each individual study. Next slide, please. So the first category of IDEs is category A. These devices are considered experimental and their absolute risk has not yet been established. So this means that the FDA is unsure whether this type of device can be safe and effective because of a lack of prior data. The device is considered revolutionary because the device may not be similar enough to other FDA-approved devices. Category A devices are summarily excluded from Medicare coverage. So that means that in these studies, the device itself cannot be billed to patient insurance. However, as I mentioned earlier, the routine care services can still be billed, but any procedures performed solely because of the non-covered device will also usually be considered a research cost. Some examples might include surgery and hospitalization that are required to implant the device, or follow-up care that's done only because the participant received the investigational device, among many others. Next slide, please. For category B devices, these devices are considered non-experimental or non-investigational by the FDA because the device type is considered safe and effective. These devices are substantially equivalent to existing devices, and in these cases, the device is considered evolutionary rather than revolutionary, and its incremental risk is what's in question in this case. That means basically the difference between the new device and existing similar devices and their functions. These studies are conducted to fine-tune the device function and or provide further support for efficacy. And in these types of studies, the device itself can be billed to patient insurance along with other routine care items and services. Next slide, please. So as far as requirements for coverage analysis for IDE studies, when you're submitting a request for CA to the CRSO for an IDE study, that was a lot of acronyms in one sentence, you want to make sure that you include the FDA letter that has the IDE number and device category determination, the CMS approval letter if the sponsor has obtained that approval, and of course the protocol, informed consent, budget, and any other relevant documents that we could review. IDE studies also require submission to our local Medicare Administrative Contractor, or MAC, which in the state of Kentucky is CGS. Renee will talk a little bit more about CGS's requirements and the submission process in the next portion of our presentation. But for now, just know that the return notification from CGS is required for finalization of the coverage analysis for your study. So we can still prepare the billing grid and you can begin working on your budget, but the study can't move forward with accrual and billing activity until we see that CGS notification come through. So I'll hand it over to Renee for the next portion now.
Hi, everyone. I get the fun job of talking about Medicare. Next slide. So Medicare coverage requirements and for IDE studies and the procedures related to them. So why does Medicare cover IDE studies? Pretty much in a nutshell, we are getting reimbursed for qualifying trials. If by chance the patient ends up in a hospital stay, the payment would be rolled up into a DRG, and that would, if it was a qualifying trial, we would receive reimbursement. And then I'm sure everyone sees these are outpatient services. So your imaging, labs, physician services, those things are getting reimbursed. So number one, we're getting our cost reimbursed on the qualifying trials. And then secondly, it really does remove financial barriers for these Medicare patients. So yeah, so it also gives Medicare patients access to new technology and innovation that might otherwise not be available for them. Next slide. So the most common question I get in my email about IDEs is, should I submit this investigational device? So right off the bat, the device, if it has FDA approval of pre-market approval or the 510K, it does not need to be submitted to CGS. Also, if the study is not Medicare qualifying, and if you're not going to bill Medicare at all, that insurance, that let's say it's commercial only, I'm not even sure if that has happened for us, but I think more likely it's sponsor paid study. So that is when you do not submit IDE, but please just email if you've got a question. Sometimes I may not know the answer and I'll submit it to CGS and I'll have to literally ask them over and over for the medical director to give an answer. But these are some good rule of thumbs. Next slide. So type of investigational exemption form requests. So definitely, if you've got a new study that you've never done, a roster change, that's a big one. You don't have to wait for the extension to submit the roster change. We can do that at any point in time, and we want to make sure that the physicians that are on the study match our billing. Of course, extension requests, any adverse events or protocol changes. So think about it as if you are submitting anything to the IRB, you also want to tell CGS. Next slide. So again, I know I've mentioned email, but that is exactly how we move forward with any investigational Medicare questions for CGS. What's great is if in the subject line, you can go ahead and put the IDE study number, the device name, and the type of the request. And the biggest reason for that is how our department, payer administration, organizes these devices. They are in folders by IDE study numbers. And so sometimes we're calling things at UK different than what CGS calls the device name. So I'm not sure if you all just have different nicknames for them, but it really helps if you have the IDE study number and the type of request. Next slide. All right, so the new study checklist, Kate went over a lot of these, but definitely you need your supporting documentation, and it would be amazing if you already had it before you're asking for the IDE request form. So this kind of outlines what exactly CGS is looking for. And also, I think one of the biggest returns on new studies or extensions is the IRB letter must have a date on it. So if for some reason the date is not there or the date of approval isn't there, just make sure you have that. That's been one of the things I've seen recently. All right, next slide. And the study extension checklist is less documentation, but what's most important is page 2 of the form. The PI must sign it, and that's really holding them accountable for any protocol changes or adverse events, if any. And then, of course, we'll provide supporting documentation from you all if there are changes or events. Next slide. So what to expect after submission? I think I was very delusionally optimistic. On the last presentation, I put 30 days, but really it's 30 business days. So I've changed it to 45 calendar days. And now that's not to say you submit something and you get your approval in 3 days. There's no rhyme and reason for that. They have until 45 calendar days, but you may receive something very soon. And I think that is it for me. I'll pass it back to you all.
Yep, so I just included all of our contact information here on this last slide in case you think of any questions after this presentation is over. We also have a website for the CRSO with some information, and we have a team email that is monitored throughout the day during business hours. And that's it from us.
Thank you all so much for attending our training today. Certainly let us know if you have any questions or we can help with anything.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks.
Thank you.